Milling Through History presents The Curious Case of Thomas Posey. When visiting George Washington's Mount Vernon Gardens and Estate, a commonly heard question asked by guests is whether George and Martha Washington ever had any children. The answer provided by the staff at the estate is repeated multiple times throughout an average day. No, George and Martha Washington did not have any children. Both the question and confusion about paternity come from the names which are given throughout the tour. John Parke Custis and Patsy Custis have a large portrait on display in the front formal parlor of the house. Eliza Custis, George Washington Parke Custis, Martha Parke Custis, and Nellie Custis are often mentioned by name in various parts of the house and have their portraits on display in the Washington bedroom. A great deal of attention is made to acknowledge the motherhood of Martha Washington. Why, then, is the fatherhood of George Washington ignored? Washington's role as a father figure is hardly ignored. He did help raise both Martha Washington's children and two of her grandchildren. However, what is it which prevented him from having children of his own? On November 4th, 1751, George Washington arrived at the island of Barbados with his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington. The reason for this journey to the Caribbean came from Lawrence's desire to find an aid to help him cure his tuberculosis. This journey would be the only time the young Washington would ever leave what would become the United States. It was 2 weeks after arriving in Barbados, George Washington began to present signs of having contracted smallpox, forcing him to remain in isolation for much of his time on the island. The disease, which had been recently present on the island, left smallpox scars on the cheeks of Washington for the rest of his life. Unbeknownst to the young Washington, a second side effect of smallpox made itself a permanent part of him: sterility. In a day and age where women were blamed for the inability to have children or carry them to full term, few would ever have thought that the man who would become one of the most famous people in the world could possibly have any issue with siring a child. Even Washington himself believed he could have children. As he once wrote, if anything were to happen to Mrs. Washington, he was still of an age to get remarried and possibly have children. This comment is rather unique, as it was the only time Washington ever expressed any issue with not having any children at any point in his life. Although Washington never had any children of his own, he could always remind himself of the number of people who named their children after him. In 1775, numerous boys were named George Washington after the British evacuation of Boston. Throughout the American Revolution, and even after, even more boys were born and given the name of the most famous American alive at the time. The most notable of these honorific names came from the Marquis de Lafayette, who named his son George Washington Lafayette. While the childless Washington became part of history and his legacy became synonymous with the creation of the United States, there were some rumblings of a possible heir to Washington. People were aware of Washington having siblings and therefore nieces and nephews. However, could there have been an unknown direct heir to Washington kept secret? In 1871, the first published story of a possible heir to George Washington was printed in Indiana regarding his relationship with the former territorial governor of the state, Thomas Posey. According to family lore, Posey was the illegitimate child of Washington. Friends of the family who knew Posey claimed the physical similarities between the two were striking. To further press the oral tradition, there were claims from some family members that the women of the family gossiped over the story while the men chose not to discuss the matter. For almost 2 generations, historians argued the connection between Posey and Washington. Thomas Posey was born July 9, 1750, just before Washington went off to Barbados with Lawrence. In his own words, Thomas Posey described his parentage as being respectable. There is no surviving documentation to show who the parents of Thomas Posey were, but it is believed his father was Captain John Posey. In addition to this, Posey acknowledged his financial status as being without fortune, but of tolerable English education. The Posey family were neighbors to Washington, living 6 miles away from Mount Vernon at a farm known as Rover's Delight. The extent of the relationship between the Washingtons and the Posey family turned into a unique one, as Captain Posey continuously failed in any business venture he entered. The result of these failed ventures led to a massive amount of debt being controlled by George Washington. As a method of payment to settle this debt, Captain Posey forfeited his land to Washington in 1768. At the same time, the Posey family, minus their patriarch, had been taken in by the Washingtons as their living conditions had become destitute. For Thomas Posey, who was 18 at the time, this set of circumstances placed him in a position to cut off ties with his father and enabled him to set forth into the frontier of Virginia, beginning to make his own fortune where opportunities were still abundant. Ironically, even Thomas Posey was continuously dogged by the rumors of his possible familial connection with George Washington during his time in the American frontier. What was it which caused so many people to ask if George Washington was his father? Part of the answer stems from a degree of physical similarities. Both Washington and Thomas Posey were tall men, and portraits of the two show some facial similarities, but also requires the viewer to be coaxed into acknowledging the two could be related. Could some early historians have believed Posey was the illegitimate child of George Washington based on flimsy evidence? When the initial article detailing the oral tradition of Thomas Posey being the son of George Washington was published in 1871, the claim indicated Posey's mother was a widow and had an illicit affair with Washington in 1754. For almost 30 years, historians discussed and debated the legitimacy of Thomas Posey's connection with George Washington. The historians at the time did not seem to have any intent on trying to disparage the name of Washington, but try to find a convincing way to link the two men together, beyond simply being neighbors and serving together during the American Revolution. While the claim of a potential Washington paternity for Thomas Posey created a great deal of uproar, subsequent interviews and publications continued to follow the same track as the first article, neglecting to cite the fact that Thomas Posey knew the date of his own birth, and the story had a large 4-year gap it could not account for. After the turn of the century, historians stopped investigating the connections between Thomas Posey and George Washington, but the specter of the rumor persisted. It was not until 1992 that family historian John Thornton Posey dismissed the claim outright and said it was nothing more than a rumor. Why, then, did the rumor persist, and so many people want to believe it? The reason for this may be due to the fact Thomas Posey lived a life of public service and dedication to his country, which would be what a citizen of the United States expected a descendant of George Washington to do. Posey rose through the ranks of the military during the Revolution, with some arguing his swift promotions came from having the patronage of George Washington. While his promotions were quick, his skills as a military commander were never questioned. His contributions to the American Revolution included protecting the American encampment at Valley Forge, capturing the colors of the 17th Regiment of Foot, and reconstituting the Virginia Continental Line after Lord Cornwallis had decimated its ranks at the Battle of Camden. After the Revolution, Posey rose to the rank of Brigadier General and helped with the Indian fighting in the Old Northwest Territory located along the Ohio River. As a private citizen, Posey served in multiple areas of government. He started his political career in Kentucky, first in the legislature, and then moving on to become lieutenant governor of the state. Following his time there, Posey moved to Louisiana and was appointed senator. Following his time in the Senate, Posey was appointed territorial governor for Indiana. In both cases of his political appointments to office, Posey was defeated for re-election. Posey's final act as a public servant was to serve as an agent for the Indian Affairs in Illinois. Thomas Posey passed away in 1818 while living in Shawneetown, Illinois, after suffering from typhus. In a final act of historical irony, Thomas Posey inadvertently created a link between himself and George Washington, which he did not have any control over. Both men were 67 when they died. For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.